Reader's Digest concludes its article critical of Israel, saying, "Antagonizing the Israeli Arabs was an obvious blunder. If treated with decency, they could have become a bridge to the Arab world." God commanded the Hebrews under Moses that once they occupied Palestine, they were not to oppress the strangers in that land. If modern Israel had obeyed no other commandment, the Mideast would not bleed today. Clearly, Israel hopes to evict the Palestinians with the power, not necessarily of guns and tanks, but of masons and bulldozers. Israel is also flooding the West Bank with hundreds of industrial plants and capital-intensive industries, economically out of reach of most Palestinians.
91% of imports to Arabs come from Israel, with trade from Arabs to Israel discouraged. Arab businesses are heavily taxed and harshly penalized for late payment. Very little outside capital which might stimulate Arab enterprise is allowed into the occupied territories.
Arabs living in Israel are subject to travel restrictions and censorship. In many departments of the Israeli government, there is no provision for Arab representation. All cultural traditions and literature which might inspire Arab pride are discouraged. For Palestinian Arabs, it is difficult just to eke out a living as a farmer. This is because the Zionists suppress competition to Israeli agriculture.
The West Bank of the Jordan is primarily an agricultural region, with Arabs depending on crops such as olives and high-quality citrus. Yet production and marketing of such perishable crops is severely hampered by Israeli checkpoints. All Palestinians, including farmers, are capriciously detained, sometimes for days, as they attempt to go about their business. Ambulances containing medical emergencies, vehicles bringing relief supplies and fresh water, as well as the average worker attempting to commute to work in Israel, are subject to the whim of guards at checkpoints. To make matters worse, the occupying Israeli army has bulldozed earthen barricades across roads everywhere in the West Bank and Gaza, often shooting at Palestinians who attempt to remove them. In fact, being randomly shot at by Israeli troops is a daily hazard to all Palestinians. If a Palestinian, young or old, is killed, there is no punishment to the shooter, whether he be an Israeli soldier or settler. Israelis will simply say they thought the Arab was intent on a suicide bombing. Case closed. Olive trees have been the basis for the Palestinian economy for thousands of years. Yet more than 6,000 olive trees have been uprooted by the Israelis. The invading Israelis also routinely destroy productive farmland and plug wells, shutting off water to a desperately thirsty land. Very few new Arab wells have been allowed in the past decades, with many being permitted in Jewish settlements. The National Geographic comments, "Since 1967, all water resources in the territory have been put under Israeli state control. Palestinians who need to drill a well or repair an old one need a permit. Such permits, which require approvals from a variety of Israeli committees and departments for a single well, are rarely granted. Today, Israelis consume 5 times as much water per head as Palestinians, many of whom must rely entirely on water trucked in from distant wells during the dry summer months. Israeli inhabitants of the settlements, where swimming pools are plentiful and crop irrigation common, use even more water."
If a Palestinian youth cannot face life as a farmer under such oppressive restrictions, he will also be frustrated in attempts to gain a higher education. All universities in the occupied territories which are critical of Israeli occupation have been closed, as well as dozens of secondary schools.
Students are subject to capricious arrest and physical punishment. Many students have been fatally shot while opposing Israeli policies. The Israelis describe such students not as patriots, but terrorists. Here, a young Palestinian is detained, stripped, forced to lie down, then shot through the head. Such atrocities are not exceptional but typical of Zionist oppression of the Palestinians. Here an Israeli soldier pulls a Palestinian girl upward by her hair. Here a soldier shoves the head of an Arab woman against a wall. The very young are especially mistreated. During the Intifada, 600 Arab children, 13 to 17 years old, were arrested, primarily for throwing stones. The sentence for most was a year in prison. They were tortured, beaten, deprived of sleep, and threatened with death. Finally, the children went on a hunger strike, but were tear-gassed in their cells. Such mistreatment turns the youth of the West Bank and Gaza not into farmers and merchants, but into terrorists. Yet this is exactly what the Israeli government wants. Every time a suicide bomber blows himself and Israelis up, the Israeli military again has a pretext and world approval to further collectively punish the Palestinians. Israel thus produces and ultimately benefits from acts of terrorism. Despite the present tragedy of suicide bombings in Israel, such terrorism makes possible Israel's long-range strategy to bulldoze Arabs off the land, to be replaced by Israeli settlements.
After more than 80 years, the Zionist objective of economic strangulation of Palestinians is succeeding. Up to 20,000 Palestinians a year despair and migrate to Europe and America. Unbelievably, the same economic backwardness which the Israelis impose on the Palestinians is used as an argument against them. Both Israelis and Christian evangelicals say Israel's prosperity, in contrast to the Palestinians, is proof that God is on the side of the Israelis. The truth is, more than $3 billion in U.S. annual aid is the real reason behind the economic success story that is Israel. The policies of Israel toward the Palestinians have been abrasive, largely because those in control, Israel's premiers, have often had shadowy backgrounds, little better than gangsters. Chief among these was Menachem Begin, head of the Zionist secret organization, Irgun. To persuade the British to leave Palestine, Begin and his fellow terrorists blew up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946, killing 200 British soldiers as well as 13 of his fellow Israelis. He masterminded the previously mentioned Deir Yassin massacre. In a conversation with British diplomat Lord Howe, Begin was asked if he was the father of terrorism in the Middle East. "No," he replied expansively, "I'm the father of terrorism in the whole world."
His successor, Yitzhak Shamir, was head of the even more radical Stern Gang, so anti-British that it offered its services to Hitler. Shamir was not above killing any fellow Jew who got in his way. When impeded in his rise to leadership of the Stern Gang, Shamir took a walk with his opponent in the sandhills south of Jerusalem. Only Shamir returned, boasting that he alone would be the terrorist ruler of the Stern Gang.
Shamir also masterminded the assassinations of Lord Moyne, British minister to the Middle East in 1944, and Count Bernadotte, United Nations Middle East diplomat, in 1948. During the Gaza rebellion in 1988, Shamir's successor, Yitzhak Rabin, showed himself capable of similar brutality. The youth of Gaza, occupants of squalid refugee camps, finally erupted in stone-throwing and street violence. Rabin gave explicit orders to all troops in Gaza to beat and break the bones of such youth without mercy. Hundreds of young Palestinians were maimed for life. The world was shocked when it learned that Israeli troops had thrown 4 Palestinian youths into a pit and buried them alive.
One of the most ruthless and opportunistic prime ministers is Ariel Sharon. As defense minister, he orchestrated Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon. He provided aerial lighting to facilitate the killing of 800 innocent men, women, and children in the infamous Shatila and Sabra massacres. An Israeli fact-finding commission condemned Sharon's role in this atrocity, yet Menachem Begin defended him. Goyim are killing Goyim, Begin said, and we have to be responsible. Begin's chief of staff, Rafi Ali Tan, referred to the Lebanese Arabs as cockroaches in a bottle.
During the Lebanon invasion under Sharon, 17,500 innocent civilians were precision-bombed into rubble. Western observers such as World Vision's Stan Mooneyham, visiting the scenes of destruction, were appalled. Israeli forces refused to allow medical supplies, food, and fresh water to the victims.